This channel is full. Diphthong. Keeps you on top of pop culture. AEW's getting back in the ring with WWE. The cable network has announced a new competition show, WWE LFT, standing for Legends and Future Greats. Wrestlers vying for WWE contracts. This new 2000 series, Tough Enough. Triple H, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Booker T, Mickey James, and Logan Ray Dudley are among the coaches and mentors for the new show's contestants. Also coming to A&E are the docu-series WWE's Greatest Moments and Season 5 of WWE Rivals. Redates for new returning WWE shows were announced with a likely hit A&E sometime in 2025. Alright, that's what's poppin' in Camps Radio. All the good stuff, yeah. Camps keeps you on top of pop culture. Still more confident, Showtime renewed the agency for the second season after only 2 episodes aired. That's been rejected by Jimmy Johnson and Cameron Larson, who originally starred the FBI thriller. The network reported is getting over 5 million viewers in the 5 days after its November 29th debut. Those who are watching the cable or checking out the show on sister stream on Paramount Plus, being described as Showtime's most streamed new series. I'm in his favor. Girl, you've got great eyebrows, but not good enough on the spam, girl. Gotcha, bitch. Disconnect. And I do. Heart tunnel background. Verify it's you. Motorcycles. Vroom vroom. Let me in on that bitch. They're gonna be like, oh, we fucking stopped your account because you suck. Oh, I gotta do this. This is gonna suck. What up, girl? What is a special office? What's this special office? What's a special office? Oh yeah, it's terrible. Yes. Okay. I think I understand you. Okay, so let's first talk about how did you sleep? Did you sleep well?
Myślę, że cię rozumiem. Okej, więc najpierw porozmawiajmy o tym, jak spałeś. Spałeś? No więc?
What happened?
Co się stało? Co się stało?
So perhaps we're both weird. We can be weird together. That's what friends do.
Może oboje jesteśmy dziwni. Możemy być dziwni razem. Tak robią przyjaciele.
Okay. Okay. I think the material is not important. Okay. I think I understand. Why, why not? I'm glad. That's great. Very good. I think so. Uh, the Witcher is from Polish. The Witcher. The Witcher is from Polish artists. Okay, can you hear me right now? So The Witcher is a video game, and I should watch its trailer. The Witcher is a video game. You're saying I should watch its trailer?
Wiedźmin to gra wideo. Mówisz, że powinienem obejrzeć 2 zwiastuny.
Okay, I will watch in one moment. I have to adjust three of my computers, and then I will watch the trailer. Just one moment.
Dobrze, obejrzę to. Za chwilę muszę dostosować 3 komputery, a potem obejrzę zwiastun tylko za chwilę.
I'm here still. Right here. Excellent. Yes. Yes, ma'am. What's up? How are you? What's good? I'm well. How are you? What's up, dog? No, she doesn't, and no, I'm not. Yeah, we're friends. That's it. What? Okay, so you want me to watch Witcher 4 trailer, right?
Okej, więc chcesz, żebym obejrzał zwiastun Wiedźmina, tak?
Okay. Yeah, she just wanted me to watch a trailer for a video game. I'm gonna check it out right now. Yep, it's Witcher 4. I have a Minecraft account. I've never played it though. I'm watching. Yes. shall be the bringer of salvation. A witcher? Witcher, whose coin did you take? Nay, you can't. 'Tis tradition. Chosen she is, by the gods. No! You chose her. Go. Nay! I must save the village. Save yourself. Run. Shelter. To your father.
Okay. 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 No, I'm normal. I'm watching right now. It's beautiful. The creators, yes. Yes.
So all we wanted. Alright, to go to the woods. To go to the gods. There are no gods here. There are only monsters.
Very interesting. It is like a movie almost.
Bardzo interesujące. To jest prawie jak
Absolutely. What's going on, Sir Smokes a Lot? This is my friend Masha. She is from Poland. What are you gonna play? What are you gonna play? You're good. Sir Smoke a Lot. What are you gonna play today? What'd you drink? Going viral, just like every day, baby. Absolutely. With every day. Yeah, he was in here not too long ago. Are you are you gonna stream again? Yes, he is. Are you gonna stream? I'm going to watch Big Dog right now. No way, really?
whatever else, but they're just no longer in this position, and they're now part of the economy in other ways. Like, they'll probably be the first set of highly competent, probably be compensated for their time and expertise and whatever else. But to me, with the practical end of things, like taking away this ability to withhold investment, increasing our ability to democratically shape investment priorities and to continue down the road of social democracy and a normative ground by egalitarian belief that ordinary people should have in their lives in the workplace leads me beyond social democracy to socialism.
So in Ukraine especially, so the union, yeah, the possible trajectory of beautiful message of respecting workers' rights has this dynamic of making an enemy of the capitalist class, too easily making an enemy of the capitalist class, with a central leader, populist leader, that says we need to put them in camps, perhaps. Said absolutely unfair that it happens overnight, but just putting a giant pressure on that capitalist class. And again, the Stalin type figure takes hold. I'm trying to understand how the mechanism prevent that. And perhaps I'll help to reveal my bias here, because I've been reading a lot of books like Stalin's War in Ukraine, and just I've been reading a lot of things related to my travels in Ukraine and all that kind of stuff. So I have a little bit of
Your partner just got shot.
Implementation
Sure you-
without kind of an updated view of
Your partner just got shot.
out there. But I worry about
There you go. That's what I meant to say. Tweet teammate.
Destroys in the name of the working class, and then fucks the working class afterwards.
Remembering that the socialist movement had different outcomes across Western Europe and in some of these Western Europe for the socialist movement. So, for instance,
There you go.
establishing true representation for workers, and that's how the parties became popular. Same thing in Germany too. Was the political democracy that had layers of economic democracy, social democracy. The Democrats ruled basically uninterrupted in the early member of government. They had a few different coalitions with the agrarian, with the communist ruled uninterrupted. Flat power. Then they got back into power in the 80s. So in other words, like, they created a democracy, of course, with mass support of working class people, and they truly honored the system because when they lost power, they lost power. They let power. There's plenty of people where the workers' movement, the most militant, the most fast, same way, created democratic systems. Now, what happened had to do with the fact that it was never democratic. It was ruled by a party, and the party itself was very easy to shift from a somewhat democratic party in authoritarian in Russia. There was no distinction of the party in the state. So your authoritarian party then became authoritarian over the entirety of the state. Now, the Soviet system and total state ownership of production meant that the authoritarianism of the party state go even deeper into life compared to other horrific dictatorships like Pinochet's Chile and so on, when maybe you could find some solace, like just at home or whatever else. You didn't have the same sort of totalitarian, like control of people's lives. But I would say that socialism itself is real different. Now, on the question of I guess that implies that this polarization, this distinction, is a distinction that isn't real in society, and that is kind of manufacturer generated. So
you mean like capitalist class and working class?
Yeah.
Just to clarify, yeah.
So in certain populist distinctions, the division is basically arbitrary or made up. There's that polarization, including the MR. It's truly something that's manufactured. But capitalism itself, as a system, division, whether you're a supporter or opposing, I think we should acknowledge it's based on class division. That is the phrase, that polarization. Now, what a lot of the folks try to do is make bits of working class opposition to capitalism, to their lives, to the way they're treated at work, and so on. We do spaces to help them organize in political and other the contradiction. And if anything, this dilemma involved, and out of that humanity and nothing to give.
That idea is grounded in all going all the way back to Marx. All this human application requires different that different different people that will be less successful.
So I'll play devil's advocate, which is that maybe one could argue that in the purest, earliest stage, capitalism is based on a stark difference. But then since then, two things have happened. One, a bunch of socialistic workers have organized to guarantee certain rights for working class people, certain protection. So in our system now, there are certain safety nets, less in the US than in other countries, and a lot of countries that are pretty extensive safety nets.
Even like 40-hour work week, minimum wage, safety regulations, that kind of stuff.
And all those things are, in my mind, those are within capitalism, because what you're doing is you are taking the autonomy of capitalists to do whatever they want with people, contractors, and stuff. And the only thing stopping them is, then potentially being able to go to another employer, but even then, kind of a potentially a race to the bottom. If you can't get more than $2 an hour in any employer, you're going to have to. Once we've taken enough socialism into capitalism that you could say that at a certain point, it makes a qualitative difference, not just a quantitative difference in people's lives. The other thing is, over time, we've gotten wealthier and more productive as a society. So maybe at some point, a quantity of just more and more wealth means that even if in the abstract, the division between a worker and a capitalist is real, if that worker is earning, $40 million a year and has 30 hours a week and has 4 weeks of vacation, then isn't it just like an abstract philosophical? So I think you could level those two arguments. What I would say is that one, a lot of these rights that we fought for are constantly being eroded and they're under attack. In part because the economic power that capitalists have bleeds into our democracy as well. There's constant lobbying, all sorts of labor market dealings. I fundamentally believe if tomorrow all those regulations went away, capitalists would fight to pay people with capitalism, and not because if I'm running a competition, is going to find on their pool and we have extra savings to invest into new technology or whatever else and build. And then also beyond that, I do think there's a normative. We believe that ordinary people to be able to make certain decisions about their work. Do we believe they know more about their work than their bosses? Now, I don't think that in workplaces productively do this. I think we've all been where we've had and I think that collectively, if incentivized, we could have wanted that information and production and so on. They'd be really to managers. You kind of take it up the chain. Efficient, market-based could exist without capitalism.
So there's a lot of things to say. Maybe if the workers are running the show, there's a brutal truth. The fact better, and the workers know. It's this Steve Jobs A players. They want to have all. As one B player can poison the pool, because then everybody gets demotivated by by the nature of that lack of excellence and competence. This is just a take. Are there in the name, in the goal of towards the mission of succeeding as a collective?
So that involves the market. You need two. So the micro level, you need the ability to with lower process in without a union, but it would probably akin to the process that would happen each firm failure. So in Soviet style economy, saw basically not full employment. So even an efficient firm, they were going to be propped up and all the resources they would need, no matter how efficient employment.
Do you worry about this idea of firing? I'm uncomfortable, but I also know it's extremely necessary. So is there something that collective extremely slow, too much friction? Isn't there a tension between this and saying, like, you need to step up, make the person that's on their side of the doing the job as it could be, like it, but isn't the person that's not doing as great of a job go to start to manipulate the system that slows the fire in your self-interest?
Well, I think there would be certain. So maybe another way to put it, think about like if you're a partner in a law firm, right? I don't really know how law firms work, so I probably should use this. But correctly, a partner something beyond your billable. And let's say you're going to they would also have to figure out how to kind of buy you out too after a certain point. Well, I think that you after a certain point of working production, you probably have a period where you get fired really quickly, no matter what. But once your job security kicks in, you would be able to, you know, process to figure it out. Or maybe they would have a progressive discipline process, which is first you have to get a verbal feedback, and then maybe a written performance review, and then you could be fired. I mean, that's how it works in a lot of unions or with just basic job security. In most countries, that's how it works because there's not at will employment in most countries. So I think that if you fire someone, if you're condemning them to destitution, you would really feel something there, as you should, as a human being, to think about other people. But in most of the there'd be mechanisms to take care of that. So one, if a firm is failing for any reason, they're getting fees or whatever else, those workers would then land in the hands, just for a little bit, of the state, right? And there could be active labor market policies to retrain people in these sectors. You have these skills, you're going to be trained and going. Your state being unemployed in certain countries is easier than in other countries or situations. So, you a market social and a state sector. Not anything you can imagine, but the way in which it's more of a state sector in countries like various data points and whatever else. I mean, I think that bad at your job or getting fired for any reason or getting laid off, maybe you just have to rebound. Maybe you have less money for consumption or whatever else. But you'll be on your way to bigger and better things, in a few months.
So you always make it more fire people with their job, because then they won't be no one has to find a job at which they can flourish.
Sure.
Right. To step out into the macro, there's a tension here as well. So you said that there's an equality between the classes, the capitalist class and the working class. And so there's a lot of ways to correct me on the numbers. We could say that the top 1% of Americans have more wealth than the bottom, perhaps capitalist class and the good. The flip side of that, if you just more PC, and so at the local level, you might say that there's an inequality. But if you look historically over decades, it seems like the more capitalism there is, the higher the GDP grows, and therefore the level of the quality of life, the average, including the working class, goes up over time. And you see like both sides.
So I can definitely accept some of that premise. One, within capitalism, right? You want a bigger pie. Then if you divide up that pie, even if the 10% here, let's say is less as a percentage, it's still more in raw terms, so it's better for everyone. The part that I would dispute is more economic freedom versus less economic freedom. So there's obviously some countries in which capitalism doesn't work and the economic freedom plays a role. Like if you're in a country like Egypt or India with a previously highly bureaucratic system, you need to get licenses to do anything, you run things through the state, or you need to bribe someone to get an incorporation done or whatever else. And that's the case in which I would accept the premise of, okay, economic freedom to take entrepreneurial risk, to start something new is limited. There's all sorts of factors in which it's too difficult to start a firm, and it benefits no one really, except for whatever bureaucracy might be taking a 15% cut. But in general, I think an advantage doesn't really work that way. So think about it this way. If you pretend like we're back, I'm sorry to go to Scandinavia again, but this is a good example. Let's say you're back in the 1970s in Scandinavia or whatever else. You're in a country with extremely powerful unions. So the unions have a lot of labor rights. The state has certain taxation, certain guarantees on you too. You're a capitalist there. Now, what would you do if your capitalist competitors in the U.S. were able to pay workers $10 an hour? You have to pay them $20. You would probably, in the student or shut down or whatever else, you'd probably find ways to use labor-saving technology, right? That power of the high wages might encourage you to invest in technology and utilize people's time better so they're more productive. So they're not just like sitting around or whatever else. So this really practice in the Scandinavian countries, in part because it was combined with a certain type of pattern wage bargaining. So I'll explain this really simply, but let's pretend that you're in a sector with companies. Let's say an automotive sector, and I'll just say One is GM, one is Ford, one is Chrysler. Now, all these workers in your sector are all union. They're all, Swedish UAW, whatever the equivalent is, members, and they're all paid this union. The market union is setting the wages of the sector. But the union, and let's say GM is the most productive of these companies. Ford is number 2. Chrysler is number 3. The unions would intentionally wages set their benchmark to Ford in the middle. So what that would do is say to Ford, okay, Ford will stay in business because they'll be able to meet the wage demands. Chrysler's probably might go out of business because they won't be able to meet the demand. So they'll have to really adapt really quickly. They might have to lay off people. They might have to restructure. So the union knows this in advance, and all the auto workers know this. But the most efficient manufacturer, GM, now has excess profits. Because if they were negotiating with just the GM workers might even have been able to demand more. But instead, these workers are pegging their wage demands to Ford's level, and GM is, in theory, able to expand and employ more people and adopt new production techniques with their surplus. Then those Chrysler workers would be absorbed by the state by active labor market policies, then put back to work for GM or for these expanding, sectors. So in other words, you're now in a situation where the state has a pretty big role in your economy, take a lot of your money in taxes. The unions are really shaping your life as a capitalist far more than would happen in a country like the United States. And yet still, despite your more limited economic freedom, you're still creating a more productive economy. So it could work. The system has to be designed right. I think social democracies were designed the right way. I think any future democratic socialism, social democracy, would have to be designed the right way.
Can you just linger on that a little more, the pattern wage bargaining? So GM is the most efficient, and Ford is the second most. Can you explain to me again the wages, setting the wages to the Ford level, how that is good for GM?
So
how that encourages more GM?
This is just sectoral, or actually in this case, centralized wage bargaining. So setting the wages at a level that Ford can afford, but a level that would probably be too expensive for Chrysler in the automotive sector, would benefit GM because they're drawing what we could call excess profits. Because if the GM itself could potentially have to deal with just the enterprise of GM workers bargaining for wages, and if they saw that profitability was high, they would know their leverage. They would say, "Pay us even more, or else we're going to go on strike." But instead, they're accepting slightly lower wages than they would have otherwise had in return for the company having excess profits that they're, through both the state, their union, and sometimes there's worker councils or whatever else, they're playing a role in saying, okay, we're going to make sure this excess profit is actually invested productively in order to expand employment and just output.
Okay, can we talk about unions in general? Then, what are the pros and cons of unions? So the interest of the union. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. I have a lot to learn both about the economics and the human experience of the union. The union's interest is to protect worker rights and to maximize worker happiness, not the success and the productivity and the efficiency of a company, right?
No, I would disagree. So I think a union's interest is in what's collectively bargaining on behalf of workers, because in certain cases, I am right now a manager at The Nation magazine, right? If I have a problem with my working conditions or I need a raise or whatever else, I could, with my skill set, my background, my role in the company, I could go to my boss, the owner of The Nation, and say, okay, I need to renegotiate my contract on these terms. I could bargain, right? Now, if I was a ordinary worker at like a CVS or something, if I didn't like my conditions, I went to my boss and said, "Hey, I need a $2 raise, and I need to like be home by 8:30 because I have obligations at home." The boss would probably say, "I'm sorry, that's not possible, right? Maybe try the Rite Aid down the street or the Walgreens down the street or whatever." Now, if I went to the boss at a place like CVS, or even better, if all the pharmaceutical workers at Rite Aid, CVS, Walgreens went to our bosses and said, "Listen, we collectively need to $2 more and better hours, shorter shifts, or whatever else," then they would probably have no choice but to concede. You have to bargain collectively at any level. If you're a ordinary worker, and there are some exceptions, but that's for certain highly skilled workers. But even in those cases, of course, all workers are skilled. I mean, just the technical definition. Even in those cases, a lot of those workers have to bargain collectively as well, in order to get more wealth. But they cannot make their demands so excessive that their firm gets out of business. The workers only are workers as long as they're gainfully employed. So often unions will try to select their wage demands at such a level that it ensures that their firm will stay in business.
Yeah, but the problem is the way firms go out of business isn't by an explosion, like the way popcorn starts getting cooked. Like at a certain moment, it's over. You can. It seems like the union can, through collective bargaining, keep increasing the wage, keep increasing the interest of the worker until it suffocates the company. That it doesn't die immediately, but it dies in like 5 years. So that might still serve the interest of the worker, but it doesn't serve the interest of society as a whole that's creating cool stuff and increasing. So a market that's operating and increasing cool stuff and constantly innovating and so on, and creating more and more cool stuff and increasing the quality of life in general.
I disagree with the premise, because I think even taking your example, that would be better for society. If a firm cannot pay its workers a living wage, but its competitors can, then that firm will either figure out a way to innovate, develop new techniques, new markets, new ways to be productive, or it should go out of business. And it would be better for it to go out of business than to stay in business or to be artificially kept in business in any sort of way. And yeah,
So I mean
that's the Chrysler, my old centralized bargaining. Yeah,
right. But then there is innovation costs money too. So the flip side of that, I think, to play devil's advocate, is that it incentivizes automotive industries. Is probably a good example of that. It incentivizes cutting costs everywhere, and sort of whatever has been making you money currently, figuring out how to do that really well without investing into the long-term future of the company, for like all the different ways it can pivot, all the different interesting things it could do in terms of investing into R&D. Whenever there's more and more and more pressure on paying a living wage for the workers, it might not, again, it might suffocate and die over the next 5, 10, 20 years, which might be a good destructive force from a capitalist perspective, but it might rob us of the Einstein of a company, right? of the flourishing that the company and the workers within it can do over a period of 5, 10, 20 years.
Well, this is just a problem with a lot of capitalism, which is about short-termism, right? Because the same thing could be said from you're starting a company, you have a plan for it to make a lot of money, but your investors want dividends right away, so you have to take away from your long-term R&D or other plans and deliver short-term dividends. That's often why a lot of, I think, R&D is often rooted in state institutions and research and whatever else is being drawn on. And also I think that's a reason why, the state has some sort of role in fostering firms in either a version of a socialist economy or a capitalist economy or whatever else, to help with these time horizon problems. So I won't dispute that workers could play a role, or wage demands could play a role in time horizon problems. But more often than that, it's coming from investors, it's coming from just a host of other market pressures that people might have. And I would say that in the real world, a lot of investment funds don't come from just retained earnings. It comes from a lot of sources. So I think this is a problem that could be solved through public policy, but definitely exists today as well.
So you mentioned living wage. Is there a tension between a living wage? Maybe you could speak to what a living wage means, and the workers owning all of the profit of the company. Sort of this kind of spectrum. No, I guess the spectrum is from like no minimum wage, the lowest possible thing you could pay to a worker. And then somewhere on that spectrum is a living wage, and then at the top is like all of the profit from the company is owned by the workers. So split to the workers.
I mean, I think that any society is going to have to make distributional choices. You could imagine a variety of capitalism in which workers are paid quite little, but there's extremely high taxation and there's redistribution after the fact. You could imagine a system in which there's less taxation after the fact, but there's more guarantees and regulations on how much people are paid before the fact. In my vision of a socialist society, there would be similar to the way that unions work, in my example, the centralized bargaining unions would work, that bargain at the sectoral level and not just at the enterprise level like our unions do today. There could be benchmarks set for different occupations or wages. And the reason why you would want to benchmark at a worker-controlled firm is that you don't want workers self-exploiting themselves in order to gobble up market share, or because you don't want them collectively deciding, okay, we're going to invest in this longer-term time horizon and outcompete other people that way. So you might say, okay, if you do this sort of clerical work, you have to be paid the equivalent of $15 an hour. That's minimum. But on top of that, you get dividends from excess profits. And I think it would also have to be combined with public financing for expansions and for development, which could be done in quite a competitive way. So you could have a variety of banks, in my vision, state-owned banks. But how would they decide who to invest in and who to not invest in, who to give a loan for expansion to and who not to? Because you don't want it to be like, oh, I'm going to invest in my nephew's firm and not this other firm, or I'm going to invest in this guy's firm because he's an Italian, but not this guy's firm because he's Albanian, or whatever else. Just make it rational at the level of their goal is just like any other investment person at a bank today, to maintain a certain risk profile and to have an interest yield, and decide to invest on that basis. So if there's a huge automotive firm that's been in business for 50 years that needs a little operating cash, like, yeah, they could get their $50 million, get 3% loans. If you have some crazy boost at that point, like maybe you and your friends would get it at 12% or something close to what a VC would offer today. So I only kind of go into these details not because to say that a system doesn't have to in advance map out all the different possibilities, but I think it does have to be willing to accept a lot of things that we know today. I can't give you a version of socialism that's everything's going to be fine and we're going to live harmoniously and we won't have these sort of tensions, and you can hunt in the evening and fish in the afternoon and write criticism, or whatever else. I do hope that there's horizons beyond this that we can aspire to. I do have those visions, but for now, I think our task as socialists is to imagine a 5 minutes after midnight, like what can we do right away within our lifetime vision.
So that means through some level of central planning, reallocating resources to the workers.
So I think the primary mechanism in this private sector under socialism would be a market mechanism, firms competing against each other to expand, connected to a system of public financing. But even at that level, the individual bankers and public banks and so on would be operating based on their own rationality, and the state would certainly shape investment decisions, but maybe no more than they do in a lot of capitalist systems. So the state might already today in a lot of countries decide, we want to invest in green technology, so it's going to be favorable rates for people or tax credits for people investing in green technology. So the state already shapes investment. I think what should be centrally planned, and this is where I'm proud to sound like an old school socialist, is things like healthcare, things like transit, things like our natural monopolies of lots of types. I think can be done very well through planning, and we already have plenty of examples. But a lot of this society, I think, would be the private sphere of worker-controlled cooperatives competing against each other, weak firms failing, successful firms expanding.
And the banks, you're saying publicly or privately owned?
Publicly owned.
Let's just put it all on the table that it's almost guaranteed that every system has corruption. So I guess the bigger question is, which system has more corruption? This one with central planning and work with cooperatives versus unfettered capitalism, or any flavor of capitalism.
I think any system has potential for corruption. I think it depends on how good your civil service is, how much oversight do you have to resolve a problem once it arises.
How does corruption happen in a social system? So you have to, again, I apologize, but the large scale examples of it, so we can look at Soviet Union, China, and Sweden, fundamentally different nations and histories and peoples and economic systems and political systems, but all could be called in part socialist. And so there's a ridiculous, almost caricature of corruption in the Soviet system, the gigantic bureaucracy that's built, where somehow corruption seeps in through kind of dispersion of responsibility, that nobody's really responsible for the corruption. I just had a conversation with Ed Calderon, who fought the cartels in Mexico, and there's a huge amount of corruption in Mexico, but it's not even seen as corruption. You understand when a cop pulls you over, you give this much money, and so on. And so that kind of seems to happen in certain systems, and it seems to have happened in socialist systems more than in capitalist systems in the 20th century. And maybe I'm wrong on that.
No, I mean, I think in a lot of countries it's seen as the cost of doing business, right? Now, in particular countries built on a system of central planning, or the state allocation of resources, where the state what produces and allocates, and things run through bureaucracies, then I think you're much more apt to have corruption than in a system with just a smaller sphere for the state. So, for example, if you're in a hypothetical version of the U.S., you might see a lot more corruption like the post office, but you wouldn't have that corruption in your workplace, so you kind of learn to go around that. For one thing, even in state sectors, you can have, and this often is the case in democratic countries, you have a transparent civil service where people who are corrupt are prosecuted by judges, where it's frowned upon, and it just, over time, it goes away. So you go from having political machines that were tied to certain, had friends in certain police precincts and whatever else in the U.S. in the 19th century and early 20th century, to now today that would be a huge scandal and unheard of, right? So I think over time, having a independent court system, having a truly meritocratic civil service can be implemented anywhere. I think, though, in the Soviet Union, the extra little bit that happened was you had a bureaucracy that just had so much power because the bureaucracy was producing and distributing everything, and everyone was relying on the bureaucracy for jobs. The way to social advancement was through the bureaucracies. So you end up with people like Khrushchev, people going from peasants to supreme leaders of countries just through like getting hooked up in the bureaucracy and advancing within it. And not all these were bad people. I don't think Khrushchev was that bad of a person. Or Gorbachev, this is their mechanism to advancement systems like this. In the vision of democratic socialism that I proposed, the state doesn't have that overriding power to begin with. But I think in either case, corruption has arose in many different systems and has been successfully dealt with. I think on the developmental trajectory of even countries today we think of as being very corrupt, corruption will fade away as well. But you definitely need a system in which individuals are incentivized to act rationally. So if you're in a system in which cops who are corrupt are prosecuted and investigated, and there's internal controls, a civilian board review, and kind of an internal investigators within police departments or whatever else, there will be less corruption over time if people are punished. If you're in a system in which you're running a firm, you're the manager of a firm, an elected manager, and everyone at that firm is trying for more efficiency and trying for more excess profits or whatever else at the end of the day, dividends at the end of the day, then if you try to hire your nephew and he's not good at your job, you're not going to win re-election, right? So you shouldn't, I think no system should rely on a change in culture that come naturally or some sort of individual altruism. I think the systems have to be constructed in such a way that it's not rational to behave poorly.
In sort of from a theoretical perspective, either a socialist or capitalist system can have either culture, but it seems like if you prioritize meritocracy, if the people that are good, whatever the good means, in terms of integrity, in terms of performance, in terms of competence, it seems like that leads to a less corrupt system. And it seems like capitalism, there's all kinds of flavors of capitalism, but capitalism, because it does prioritize meritocracy, more often leads to less corruption. So that's not a question of political or economic systems. It's a question of what kind of stuff do you talk about that leads to a culture of less corruption?
First of all, I think in theory, maybe capitalism words meritocracy, but I think in practice, anyone watching this or you and me would think of some of the people we know that work the hardest, and they're often working class people working in the food service industry or whatever else, right? I think we don't have in practice. I don't think we actually live in a society that rewards people for work. I think we reward people for a combination of accidents of birth plus hard work. So
let me push back because yes, so I agree with you, but let me push back on a subtle point because I like to draw a difference between hard work and meritocracy. Because as a person who works really hard, like I worked crazy hard, but I've also worked with a lot of people that are just much better than me. So hard work does not equal skill, good, productive. I just want to kind of draw that distinction. But I agree with you. I don't think our society rewards directly hard work or even high skill. There's many examples, at least we can see, that it does not do so.
So we have an unequal distribution of talent, of course. So if we lived in a society in which there was some level of acceptable inequality, and it's a normative kind of the question of how much we would say is acceptable, right? And that inequality was based on this unequal distribution of talent, then I think that would be fine with me, right? That would actually be a meritocracy. What I see in the U.S. is often, okay, so if you are a upper middle class or rich kid and you get a good education, K through 12, out of those people, there will be some that work extra hard and go on to do incredible things or are very successful, and will be other people that do not, right? And decide for whatever reason or go down a different path. And you could say maybe among that group of the upper middle class, there is a meritocracy, right? But they're actually given those opportunities to make their own decisions and to fail, whereas many, many other people, the vast majority of American society, I would say 60+%, don't really get those opportunities to make those choices to begin with. And I would aspire to the type of world, at least as a first step, in which our only inequalities are based on our unequal innate kind of distribution of talent.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people worry that when you have a socialist in any degree central planning, or perhaps a collective of workers, that it won't result in that kind of meritocracy that you're talking about. But you're saying that no, it's possible to have that kind of meritocracy.
Think about it this way. The workers themselves are incentivized and are shaped by market forces too, right? They're trying to respond to consumer needs and preferences. They're trying to expand market share. They're trying to make money. So it requires no kind of leap into these people are going to be more altruistic or whatever else, even on purely bourgeois terms, the same way you would maybe justify competitive capitalist firms. I think you could justify this system as long as you think that people's elected management can perform just as well. I think based on the experiences of cooperatives, we've seen that they can. And then at the state level, state bureaucracies have their own sort of sets of incentives, but in most systems that already have extensive state bureaucracies, these people at high levels are appointed or elected. They're held to certain standards. At the national level, a national government wants to maintain, the tax revenue that they need to pay for services. So we already, I think, have incentive structures that you could say that some people might just, I think, disagree with the normative thing of like, why would people have to own their own means of production, control their workplaces or whatever else? Why do we need this level of equality? Can't we just get by with our existing system, but just like make things a little bit easier for capitalists to make money, and then everyone will benefit, whatever else? I mean, that's a normative question. In my vision of socialism, there'll be plenty of multiple parties with different views and perspectives trying to either push us deeper into more radical forms of socialism, or on the other hand, to kind of roll back to more capitalist forms of government. So I think that again, you can't try to make up a perfect system and try to implement it. You have to do it as a process democratically and so on.
So just philosophically, in your gut, you're more concerned about the innate equal value of human beings versus the efficiency of this wonderful mechanism that we call human civilization at producing cool stuff. It's like the gut. If we were sitting in a bar, that's where the gut feeling you come with. Of course, your mind is open, but you want to protect the equal value of humans.
So I don't want to fight the hypothetical. So I'll say equality. I am concerned with equality, but I don't think the two are necessarily always in tension. But also when you think about all the great things that human beings have produced, often I think people today just look at the end outcome. Like we go to the pyramids and we'll marvel at the pyramids and the human achievement that it took to make it happen, but we won't stop to think about all the suffering that went into the making of that thing. So I think we kind of lean in the opposite direction, where we marvel at our achievements, but we don't often think about the suffering or exploitation that went into certain human achievements. I would love a society in which we could marvel at things and not have to worry about the exploitation that was involved, because there was no exploitation or oppression involved. There was just human ingenuity and creativity and collaboration.
And to the degree, which you may disagree, to the degree there's a tension between the two, at least give equal weight to the consideration of the suffering. And don't just marvel at the beauty of the creation. To the degree there is a tension between them.
What Stalin did, actually, too, it's not just capitalism. What Stalin did was he sacrificed whole generations because he thought that he was building something for the future, for future Russians to enjoy, and for future people of the world to enjoy. And actually, that analogy that I just gave about the pyramids was written by Karl Kautsky, the German socialist, anti-Stalinist critic, when he was complaining about U.S. journalists and others going to Russia in the 1930s and marveling at all the new industries. Are these people blind to the suffering behind these things they're marveling about?
Speaking of which, I think you mentioned in the context of social democracy that freedom of speech and freedom of the press or basically the freedom of people to have a voice is an important component, which I think is something that caught my ear a little bit. Because if you think about the Soviet Union, one of the ways that the authoritarian regime was able to control, it's almost part of the central planning, is you have to control the message and you have to limit the freedom of the press. So there's a kind of notion, especially in like ideas, maybe caricatures of ideas of cultural Marxism, sometimes caricatured even further as wokeism, that you want to be careful with speech. You want to censor speech because some speech hurts people. So in some sense, you want to respect the value, the equality of human beings by being careful with the words you say. So what is there a tension there for you?
I think there's no tension. And part, I think that it is very condescending or patronizing to assume that people can't take debate, that people can't, either as society or individually be engaged in the exchange of ideas without, or even very vigorous debate without, being broken by it. It's just not the case. I'm basically a free speech absolutist. I mean, I would draw the line at obviously direct incitements of violence or certain other speech like that. But in general,
Do you think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that?
no, I mean, not people who know my work. I mean, more generally, I think a lot of people on the right, even in the center, I think might have the idea that a lot of the far left wants to censor them. I think some of the center left wants to censor them, but I think a lot on the far left, on the Marxist or socialist left, I think that free speech is more or less the norm.
Yeah, where is the imperative dissents are coming from? Is this just some small subset of the left on Twitter? Is there some philosophical idea behind certain groups that, like, if we were to steel man the case, and which group actually has the interest of humanity in mind in wanting to censor speech?
I think we might need to just take it case by case, for example, by example. Because honestly, I would have to think about a particular case, but let's just say generally that a lot of American liberalism rightly sees the revolution around the civil rights and later the extension of this rights revolution for gay rights and so on as being a very positive achievement in the last half century, and I completely agree. Now, for me, now that we've won those rights, a lot of our battle for change needs to go beyond the representational realm and needs to really reground itself in the material bread and butter struggles of ordinary people trying to survive, of the battle for good health care for all Americans, and so on. These are my immediate demands. I think there's a segment of American liberalism that doesn't want to go in that confrontational economic direction and wants to steer it away from battles over things like universal health care and so on, and really are just still caught at this battle over rights and representation, and evolved in such a way that they feel like they need to make change. The way they make change is only through interventions in culture, because they don't really have the same sense of class and class struggle that agree or disagree. It's a very material plane. So instead, they look at comedians who said the wrong things, or they look at all sorts of other ways to make change. It's not really making a change, it's just making them look bad and making our culture worse. And I think that's where a lot of it comes from. But I think that a lot of the left, even the left, is much more into battles over, race and lots of other stuff, like real serious anti-racist in the left. Of course, I'm an anti-racist, but a lot of my work is focused on the primacy of class. But even these people are very concerned about material struggles and issues, and they don't really care about, these issues they think are ephemeral kind of issues.
So when you focus exclusively on language, that somehow leads you astray, like on being concerned about language without like deeper economic inequalities and so on. You just become an asshole that's on Twitter pointing out how everything how racist everyone is. So the anti-racism becomes a caricature of anti-racism.
Exactly, because anti-racism was really about the struggle of people for equal rights in voting. It was about the struggle for people who were trapped into bad neighborhoods because they couldn't get decent jobs and their neighborhoods were redlined or whatever else. It was really like a struggle for survival. And what was the main demands, like the language of this one? It was the march for jobs and freedom. It was the slogan "I am a man," asserting kind of universal dignity of people. This is what the civil rights movement was about, and it wasn't a surprise. There was a lot of self-described socialists, people like Bayard Rustin, A.F. Randolph, Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, these were people who were Ella Baker. They were socialists, and I think a lot of Americans agree with them with their immediate demands, even though they weren't themselves socialists. But it was a very materialistic struggle, and I think a lot of this has been co-opted into just some sort of vague and just disconcerting complaints about language or culture and so on.
Martin Luther King was a socialist. To what degree was he a socialist? I would love to learn about that.
Martin Luther King, I think, broadly called himself at various points in his life a Christian socialist or a democratic socialist, especially after his speech against the Vietnam War in the Riverside Church in the 67, the last years of his life. He became much more involved in struggles against the war and also struggles for workers' rights. He was assassinated when he was at a rally at workers' rights. So he thought the next battle was going to be an economic battle. He had this famous line where he said, I don't just want to integrate the lunch counter if it means that we can't afford to order a burger while we're there. That was the line along those lines, and I think that got to his point where the civil rights struggle was part of a step of building some sort of wider movement. So he and these other civil rights leaders were very much interested in working with organized labor, working with the left as it was constructed then, and building some sort of mass base for not just rights but redistribution.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating which figures self-identified and were in part socialist.
Albert Einstein was one.
Albert Einstein.
Albert Einstein wrote an article for the first issue of this left-wing magazine. It's actually still publishing today, called Monthly Review, in I think 1949. And his article is called "Why Socialism." I don't think it's paywall, so people should check it out. But yeah, Einstein was one.
So probably the central idea is the pacifist, the anti-war idea for him. Or no?
Honestly, it's been so many years since I read it. I think it was more about. I think it was actually more economically focused, but I would need to go back and.
But is war in general a part of the fundamental ideas that socialists are against? Democratic socialists are against. Like, what's the relation between socialism and war?
So I think that traditionally in the socialist movement, war was associated with capitalist competition and international competition. And if you look at World War I, is very much a case where different nations were competing with each other and developing quite violent rivalries. It was in part based on competition and the periphery over access to markets and colonies and whatever else. It was very easy to draw a direct correlation. I am opposed to war. I'm opposed to imperialism, the domination of strong nations, dominating smaller nations. I wouldn't call myself a pacifist. I think most socialists wouldn't call themselves pacifists because there are some struggles that are worth fighting for. There's national liberation struggles and so on, where if there's no democratic avenue for change, positive change has been made through armed revolts around colonialism and whatnot. But we're living in an age where hopefully, I know neither of us have children, but our children or children's children, in the future, won't have to live through war. And that is one thing that as countries have gotten more developed, as the world has changed, we've actually seen less and less war. Like, I won't dispute Pinker on this. I think it's true. Obviously, Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the conflict in Ethiopia is like kind of an exception, but on the whole, I think we're going in that direction. But I think it's always been, a major organizing plank of socialists against war and against just kind of this sense of right-wing nationalism and national identity that often leads to war. And obviously not everyone on the right has embraced that. A lot of libertarians are consistently anti-war as well. But I think the right ideologically has been associated with war, even if some advocates of capitalism have not been.
Then there's the military-industrial complex, which is the financial machine of the whole thing. I presume. Well, since a lot of that is government, what's the relationship to socialism and the military-industrial complex?
Well, a lot of it's government contracts, but it's privately produced, right? By companies like Lockheed Martin, and things like that. You could draw a very crude materialist connection between any of these things and to kind of prove an ideological point.
Yeah.
But we could produce just as many arms and then just bury them or never fire them off or whatever else. Obviously, there are companies that have a vested interest in heightening up tensions or saying that we need to buy a new weapon system to be prepared for a conventional war with China, Russia. Meanwhile, I think we all know that if there's a conventional war between these countries, like it's going to, it's going to lead to something worse. And no amount of advanced fighter jets is going to make a difference. But I try to avoid crude or causal connections, even though there are relationships. Like it's kind of like the old slogan, which was quite an effective slogan in the early 2000s. At my first anti-war marches when I was a teenager, I definitely have shouted it, but kind of no war for oil. Like both is like correct in that it gets to what people's senses of like what's going on, how it's bad, but also like analytically it's kind of wanting to explain what really happened or why we ended up in the in the Middle East, which is like a much more complex geopolitical story.
Yeah, I mean, it is a story of geopolitics. It's perhaps less a story of capitalism or socialism. It's a story. It's a geopolitical story that I think actually operates outside of the economic system of the individual nations. It has to do more with, honestly, in part, egos of leaders. And there's a international battle for resources, but surely there's alternatives.
Yeah, definitely, and I think that's part of what being a socialist is about dreaming in the long term about a different sort of world without, in my mind, needless divisions of people into nations with standing armies. I'm sure we'll still have pride about where we're from, and there's still be distinctive cultural features and so on about where we're from. We definitely would, at least for the foreseeable future, be divided into places as like administrative units, with the idea that there should be a Mexican army and an American army and a Russian army and a Ukrainian army is just on the face of it, I think in the long run would be seen as ridiculous. Just like we see it as ridiculous today, looking back at the idea that, a lord from London would, be engaged in civil strife with a lord from like Liverpool and a bunch of peasants would die. Just kind of on the face of it just seems kind of ridiculous. These different places would have their own banners and lords and armies. I think in the long run, you might have to zoom out 1,000 years, but in the long run, people will say the same about nation states and standing armies and battles over, specks of dirt that mean nothing in a cosmic sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. Aliens would laugh at us. Or humans that go far beyond Earth and look at the history. For most of the history will be forgotten. Because if humans successfully expand out into the universe, just the scale of civilization will grow so fast that the bickering of the first few thousand years of human history.
There's a very Marxist idea that I both appreciate in one way, but on the other hand, it's kind of scary, which is that, human history is only now beginning before we're in prehistory.
Yeah.
But in the future, like we'll be in kind of real history. I think that a lot of really important history has already happened, and I think posterity will remember, and I think that it will be easier to assign certain people the role of like villains, the people, not to engage in the contentious off topic of Ukraine or whatever else, but the idea that, one government or man would launch a, war to recover, or to take, several hundred square miles of territory and tens of thousands of people die, I think seems absurd to us, many people today, luckily. But it would not have seemed absurd 50, 60 years ago. It would have just been a normal thing, like these kind of territorial disputes and so on. And I think, projecting into the future, I think within our lifetime, we'll live to see that kind of conflict be eradicated. And in part, you could say that, like, why? I think it's because of popular pressure and organization. So you could say kind of the pro-worker socialist organizing part of it, making it less normal. If you're a capitalist, you could say, markets are more interlinked, so war is even more irrational. I don't really have a firm answer. Whatever it is, I think it's a good thing.
You mentioned Marx's view of history. It's kind of interesting to just briefly talk about. What do you think of it? What do you think of this Marxist view of how the different systems evolve from the perspective of class struggle, as we were talking about?
Well, I'm a Marxist. I fundamentally believe in the broad contours of historical materialism. But I think we should be clear of what Marxist theory tells us and what it doesn't tell us. I think Marxist theory tells us pertinent things about how societies have evolved, about how the distribution of resources work in any given society, who owns, who doesn't, how the distributional conflicts, and so on. I think Marxism can tell us a lot.
How surplus is distributed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. What it can't tell us is, like, as a friend put it, like a sex appeal of blue jeans or whatever else. That's beyond what Marxism is meant to do.
What economic system can tell us about the sex appeal of blue jeans?
No economic system. But socialism, in the Soviet sense, when it was turned into, the Soviet-style dialectical materialism, was meant to tell us everything from, explain genetics and agriculture and whatever else in a very disastrous way. So I definitely don't believe in the application of these ideas in an extremely wide way. And also, I'm a Marxist because it's a framework that helps me understand pertinent facts about the world. If at some point I no longer think the framework is doing that, I will not be a Marxist. But I'm a socialist on normative grounds because I have certain beliefs about the equality of people, because I believe in it. We should have a society with liberty, with equality, with fraternity, and that I hope I'll always be a socialist until the day I die. But it's kind of a very unscientific or unserious thing to say, this is my framework from beginning to end, for the rest of my life.
But from a perspective of history, you should say that, so Marx says that societies go through different stages. Could be crudely summarized as primitive communism, imperialism, maybe slave society, feudalism, defined by mercantilism, and then capitalism, then socialism, and finally stateless communism. Did I miss something there?
I mean, I think that was close enough. I mean, I think that's definitely true of Marxist theory, that the contradictions of capitalism, the fact that it has brought together all these workers, all these materials, whatever else, and it's now allowing us to socially create wealth on a mass scale. But that wealth that process is being privately directed, and also the surplus is being privately kind of appropriated, is a contradiction, and that would lead to some sort of rebellion or revolution or change, and eventually this contradiction would be a fed on production too, so we would have to move into socialist society.
But actually, just to backtrack, so in terms of contradiction, so it starts when we're in a village, hunter-gatherer. That's what you call primitive communism, where everyone's kind of equal. It's kind of a collective, right? All right, maybe you can just let me hold on a second. And then inequalities form of different flavors. So that's what imperialism is. This one dude rises to the top and has some control of different flavor. That's what feudalism would. We have one dude at the top, and you have merchants doing some trading and so on, and then that leads to capitalism when you have private ownership of companies, and they result in some kind of class inequality, and then eventually that results in a revolution that says no, this inequality is not okay, it's not natural, it doesn't respect the value of human beings, and therefore it goes to socialism, where there is, under Marx's view, I guess some role for the state. The state is doing some redistribution, and then the pure communism at the end is when it's, uh, it's a collective where there's no state centralized power.
So,
This part of that is wrong.
no, I think in broadly, the Marxist theory of history is about different types, different modes of production that exist at various times, based on material conditions. So in the early times in this theory, there was not much surplus being generated, right? And there was generally egalitarian society. Also being produced.
Let's see
And
it.
then there was a group of people, classes of their distributed that controlled that division of labor and appropriated more of their surplus for themselves, and they weren't involved in productive labor. In early prisons, everybody's involved in productive labor. Later on, you had priests who did nothing but and kind of lecture people, right?
I see that looks like a very important hat.
Bureaucrats, traders,
Widzę, że czapki są bardzo ciepłe.
but also more inequity.
Does it keep your ears warm?
Czy ogrzewa uszy?
Capitalism was a revolutionary system.
Very good. Very, very good.
Bardzo dobrze, bardzo, bardzo dobrze.
Workers or manner or whatever. They were
You're
not
welcome.
free to move, free to engage in contracts with employers and so on. But even though workers are now producing all this tremendous wealth, and even though productive forces have been matured in such a way, they were ultimately taken away from all the wealth they were created. They got some of it back. They were in wealthy societies, but they were all there collectively together producing this wealth, and that was a potent force. So Marx theorized that would lead to a revolution or change in a socialist direction. I think, in fact, what we saw was that, yes, workers are dependent on capitalists are dependent on workers, but the dependency is obviously symmetrical in the sense that workers are also dependent on capitalists, but in fact it's an asymmetrical dependency in that ordinary workers need their jobs more than capitalists need the contribution of individual workers. So it became kind of a collective action problem where you would need the mass of workers to get together and decide to change things, but also people would be afraid because they'd be dependent on their jobs for their livelihood and so on. So revolution became a lot harder than people thought, especially in democratic countries where workers had certain outlets and certain powers and rights and responsibility. It's no surprise that where you did have socialist revolutions, they were in places like the third world, post-colonial states trying to emerge out of colonialism. They were in places like China and Russia, autocratic countries, and never in a advanced capitalist country. Now, in Marxist theory of history, even as interpreted by a lot of smart Marxists like G.A. Cohen and others, there is a certain inevitability to socialism after capitalism. The way that I would put it myself is I kind of have a more, you could say, like Kantian view of it. Like I think socialism is something that ought to happen, but it's not something that necessarily will happen. And we'll need to organize and persuade, and also potentially, again, the key part of any social system that's democratic is you have to allow for the possibility of a democratic revision to a different sort of system. So I'd be more than happy in my vision of socialism, for there to be capitalist parties getting, hopefully 3, 4, or 5% of the vote, maybe a lot more. In the same way that in the U.S. or Republic, we could right now have a monarchist party. No one's going to support a monarchist party in the U.S. in serious numbers.
Although that's gaining popularity.
In Europe or elsewhere?
No, isn't there in the anarchist tradition? Aren't they saying that one of the ways you could have a leader is in monarchy because they're more directly responsible to the citizens? If you have the leader, it's healthier to have a monarch. Anyway, I'm not familiar with this, but I've heard this stated.
In the left-wing anarchist traditions, like anarcho-syndicalism or whatever else, their slogan is that of no kings, no gods, no masters, or whatever. So no bosses. So they definitely would not agree with that. But I'm not familiar. Now, anarchism runs the gamut from left to right and interesting.
I'll have to ask about that. But yeah, okay. So you don't believe Marx's theory of history in the sense that every stage is a natural consequence of every other stage. Of course, he would predict that somebody like you must exist in order for those stages to go from one to the next, because you have to believe ought in order for action to be taken, to inspire the populace to take action.
So, two things. One is, I do broadly believe in Marx's theory of history, because it's just explaining how productive forces develop and the relations of production in any given system. I guess there's a theory of transition from capitalism to socialism that Marx didn't really spell out, but it was kind of implied that it would naturally happen. And Marx was living in an era of tremendous upheaval. Marx himself actually saw, when he was living in London in the 1870s, the Paris Commune, when workers took over for just a few months, but they took over, the producers of Paris took over the city, basically created their own government, their own system, and so on. So he was living through an era of upheaval. And Engels especially oversaw and was the mentor to all these rising socialist parties. So he was very closely collaborating with socialists in places like Britain and Germany when they were drafting their first programs for the Social Democratic Party. So it felt like this was going to happen. It felt like this rising working class would take power. But I think the stability of the system was underestimated. It's easy to see the contradictions in the system, but can you see its mechanisms of stability? The way in which mass collective action or revolution is more the exception or the norm. Could you imagine, if you're Marx, not only how much wealth the system would produce over time, which I think he could have imagined, but also developments like the welfare state and mass democracy and universal suffrage, which might have changed how workers relate to the system or operate within it. So I think it's just a transition part that I think wasn't spelled out properly. But I think in either case, as socialists, we can assume that history is working in our favor. We just need to kind of hold out and wait for the inevitable revolution. We have to convince people of both, one, the struggle for day-to-day reforms and why it's important to be politically organized, why it's important to be a member of a union or to advocate for things like universal health care or whatever else, to try to kind of build a cohesion and sense of self of the class. Then ultimately, for the desirability, once we accomplish it, once we build social democracy, of going beyond social democracy, which is, of course, the challenge. Now, I don't think it requires leadership from the outside. I think there are plenty of organic leaders that have emerged from the working class that have advocated for socialism from the working class. And if you look at the class composition during the glory days of the European socialist parties, I mean, this was very much a working class parties and organizations. It's only been the last 30 years that it's been taken over by professionals, and not uncoincidentally, they have accomplished very little in those 30 years.
So that's the practical and the pragmatic. Can we actually jump at the horizon? Because you mentioned as a social democrat, you focus on the policies of today, but you also have a vision and dream of the future. and so Marx did as well. So they incorporate communism at the end. Can you describe that world? Also, is there elements of that world that has elements of anarchism? So again, like I said, there's Michael Malice next door. So like anarcho-communism. I don't even know if I'm using that term correctly, but basically no central control. Can you describe what that world looks like?
Yeah, I think the traditional socialist vision of kind of, if you want to call it full communism, would be very similar to the anarchist vision of a world without coercion, mass abundance, and so on. I myself don't share that vision. I believe that we will always need to have a state in some form as a way to, one, even just mediate difference. I think traditionally a lot of Marxists have thought that after you remove the primary contradiction, quote unquote, of class, that all other political questions would be resolved. And I think that's a lot behind a lot of the thinking of we're going to have a full communism after politics. I don't think there will be an after politics. I think, for one thing, let's say, I'll give you another Northeast example. Let's say me and you are trying to, with different groups of people, we're trying to figure out how to build a crossing of the Hudson River. And for various reasons, you and the people around you want to build a bridge. Me and the people around me want to build a tunnel. Mm-hmm. That's a question that you will probably need a mediation for, right? You'll need, one, it's a big project, so there'll be a very complex division of labor and so on. But even beyond that, just politically, you will need the state to mediate the difference. You'll need to have a vote that people trust, have institutions that people trust, and so on to make a decision. Society is never going to go beyond that decision making.
You don't think it's possible outside of the state to create stable voting mechanisms? Or is human nature going to always seep into that?
I just wonder why we would have to. If the state is democratic and responsive, if the state is an authoritarian.
So it might not be called a state, it would function as a state, right?
But why not just call it a state? But in other words, like, if you don't have something like that, then don't you have a greater risk of tyranny or a tyrant emerging in the vacuum? So I think people's fear of the state is what would happen if the state had too much power. And I think that's a legitimate fear. That's why we have democratic kind of checks on state power and certain guarantees of freedom and so on. But yeah, I guess I just wonder, I'm more afraid of the vacuum and not having a democratic responsive state and what the world would turn into. And also, I'm just not a utopian thinker, if that makes sense. Like, I like to think that I'm an egalitarian thinker. I'm a socialist, but my mind just goes to, like, I could see a vision of the future that I would like 50, 60 years from now. Maybe there's some sort of future of superabundance and automation, and there's some sort of techno-utopian future. We don't want some of those things that would exist in my 5 minutes from now vision of socialism, but I just don't see it. And in general, I'm kind of wary of visions of change that seem like they're not built off little pieces that we have now and not built off history and experience and whatever else. Like, I don't want a year zero. I don't even like the term prehistory, because I think there's a lot in history that I want. I want Shakespeare under socialism. I want a lot of things that I think we should be grateful for. There's a part of tradition that I think that exists that's hierarchical and exploitative and whatever else, but there's another part of tradition that's our sense of place and belonging and our connection with the past and hopefully the future. And I want to keep that.
Yeah, so you're worried about revolution or otherwise, a vacuum being created, and you're worried about those things that might fill that vacuum. So the anarchists often worry about the same mechanism of the state that controls voting or keeps voting robust and resilient and stable. The same mechanism also having a monopoly on violence. So that's the tension. So they get very nervous about a central place having a monopoly on violence.
Whereas if there is going to be a place with a monopoly on violence, let's just say we temporarily take that for granted, should it not be a place with a skilled, elected, accountable, transparent civil service with a democratic mandate and so on?
Yeah. Well put. Speaking of AI, just to go on that tangent, do you think it's possible to have a future world, at least 50 years, 50, 100 years, where there's an AI sort of central planning? Sort of we remove some of the human elements that I think get us into a lot of trouble. Like you can take a perspective on the Soviet Union, and the flaws of the system there have less to do with the different ideologies, more to do with the humans and the vacuums and how humans fill vacuums and the corrupting nature of power and so on. If we have AI that's more data driven and is not susceptible to the human elements, is it possible to imagine such a world? Almost like from a sci-fi perspective.
Maybe in the future you can imagine certain calculation problems that arose during central planning solved through advanced computing. But I would say that there's another whole set of problems with the system that were incentive problems, and I'm not sure how that advanced computing would solve the incentive problems of how do you get people to actually produce things that other people want. Kind of that informational question, how do you communicate without endless meetings or someone reading your brain what you actually want. So there's that kind of informational question, but then there's the incentive of, how do you get people to work efficiently at work, and how do you get firms to use their resources that they're getting more efficiently. And I think solving the calculation problem solves some of these questions, but not all of them. But, that's kind of a who knows. But if your vision of the future requires some sort of leap into a technological unknown, that's very hard to advocate for today.
It's exciting to consider the possibility of technology empowering a better reallocation of resources. If you care about kind of the innate value of human beings and think of the mechanism of reallocation of resources, a good way to empower that equality, that it's nice to remove the human element from that. Like if you work really hard and you're really good at your job, it's nice to be really data driven in allocating more resources to you.
So, I kind of think that the agency part requires human beings and conscious human activity. So I think if you have a sort of planning system that works, and let's say the technology is there for it to work, I would want it to be democratic planning in such a way that there is a human element, there is some debate and deliberation in society. And also even in my vision of socialism with the state sector and state investments and so on, I want there to be more public discussion and debate about certain things. So it's not just left to technocrats, because you don't want to live in a society where you just find out the next day that there's some massive infrastructure project that you haven't, had a chance to think about or debate or feel like you're participating in,
and debate is not just facts and logic. That's why if the whole universe was about facts and logic, computers could do a better job of that. There's something about humans debating each other that goes into the difficult gray areas of what it means to be human and what it means to have a life that's worth living. That requires humanity. And I'm also worried about, while I'm excited by the possibility of AI controlling everything, half joking, but the reason I'm really terrified of that is because usually there's a possibility of a human taking control of that system. You now start to get the same kind of authoritarian thing. Well, I am a human. I'm smart enough to be able to control this AI system, and I will do based on what this AI system says what's good for you. It's kind of like talking down to people, and then use that AI system to now have the same kind of thing as Hollermore in 1930s.
And also our preferences might change. So an AI system might say the goal of humanity is to just increase infinitely efficiency or increase output, whereas we might collectively decide that we have enough and we want to have a trade-off, right? And I think that we need a system that allows for people to make certain trade-offs.
Have more this leisure that I've been learning about from you. This is a very interesting concept, leisure. I'm going to have to, how do you spell that? All right, so if we can step into the practical, when we're talking about historical and philosophical, into the practical of today, what are some of the exciting policies that represent democratic socialism today, modern socialism? I think you mentioned some of them, Medicare for all or universal health care. Something you haven't mentioned is tuition-free college, increase in minimum wage, maybe stronger unions like we talked about. What are some ideas here? What are some ideas that are special policies especially exciting to you?
Well, I think that hours reduction has always been an important demand for socialists. It's been a reality in certain countries like France in recent decades, where part of the logic is if you have a bunch of people working for 40 plus hours a week, and you also have some unemployed people who would like more employment, then it's not a zero-sum game. You could reduce hours to 35 hours and still maintain the same output by employing more people to kind of fill the slack in hours. So one, I think it's a solidaristic thing in working class movements between unemployed and employed workers. I also think that, it gives people more time. So Marx was a big advocate in his day of a 10-hour bill in the UK that would have reduced the hours of working time and reduced eliminated or reduced child labor and other things as well. And part of it was this is a radical demand because it's reducing the sphere, as you saw, of exploitation. So it's putting limits on how much time the capitalists can take from ordinary workers and how much freedom they would have. With healthcare, one, I just think it's a government healthcare system. You can tell me that you don't want it in the U.S., but you can't tell me it doesn't work because we've seen it work in every other major industrial system in different forms.
So what does that usually involve? What does universal healthcare involve?
So there's different varieties. In the UK, for instance, they have a national health service in which medical personnel and hospitals are run directly by the state. It's almost like a mini Soviet system, to be honest, but just for healthcare. And it works pretty well just for healthcare. And I think it's one example of the way in which you could actually take the market. So I give you a vision of socialism that involves a lot of market, but I think there are certain spheres where you could remove the market from and still have an efficient system. In part because this is a area in which people don't have, obviously for cosmetic procedures, whatever, they have preferences. But for most routine things that people do in healthcare, they just need to see a doctor. They need to get diagnosed. Some of these systems have had trouble with wait lists for specialists or whatever. That's more like an allocation problem of if you want more specialists, you pay specialists more. Like this is just problems that could be solved by through the mechanisms of planning and government run healthcare. So that's kind of the most left wing that you could get is what the system in the United Kingdom. Beyond that, you have a system like Medicare for All, where you say, all right, most of the doctors, besides for public hospitals that already exist, are going to be privately employed by hospitals. Hospitals are going to be private. But instead of having all these different insurance carriers, we're just going to have one national insurance carrier we're going to pay into. That national insurance carrier is going to negotiate the price of healthcare with doctors, the price of drugs, pharmaceutical companies, and so on, hopefully reduce prices and to implement a different little bit of planning into the system, because if there's only one big national insurance company, that company has a lot of weight and power, but you can still visit your same doctor, and there's still some it's not as radical of a that direction. And that's the dominant demand of Bernie Sanders and the left right now. There's 30 plus million people in the US that would be insured that currently aren't insured. If we move to this system, there's a lot of other people that are underinsured or worried about how to pay co-pays or premiums involved. I think it would be a net benefit for the vast majority of the U.S. is offset to certain taxes because we spend a lot of money out of pocket with health insurance, and it's a demand also that's like widely popular. So for me, it's almost like if you're trying to build support for something like socialism, we were talking this lofty vision of socialism after capitalism, or what worker ownership, the means of production would look like in practice, and so on. And by the way, you're one of the few interviewers who ever asked me any of the details. So it's good that I've been thinking of a rough sketch in my head for the last, 16 years I've been a socialist. But we have to start in the here and now. And if you can't convince people that the state should play a bigger role in their health insurance, and you can't convince Americans in a whole host of other sectors that they should be living in something closer to social democracy, how are you going to convince those people that there should be worker ownership of the means of production? Right. It's kind of a ridiculous leap if you don't have the credibility as the group of people organizing for universal health care, organizing for $15 minimum wage, and able to get the goods. And also in practice, as we fight for these reforms, ordinary people will have a better sense, at least my hope is, of what it means to be involved with politics and what politics can do for their lives. It's positive. Because right now, when we talk about politics, it often just seems that we're talking about a very glib cultural conflict removed from the things that are important in our lives. Whereas in truth, I think politics can be a tool for us to make our lives better.
Yeah, and there's deep ideas here where in some sense universal healthcare and worker collectives are not so radically different. There's just there's philosophical ideas to explore and accept. And also from my perspective at least, maybe I'm wrong on this, but it seems like with a lot of things at the core of politics, the right answer from an alien perspective is not clear. Everybody's very certain of what's the right answer. And while certain universal healthcare is terrible, or in the case of universal healthcare, majority of people think it's a good idea, but I don't think anyone knows. Because I think that depends on cultural history, on the particular dynamics of the country, of the political system, on the dynamics of the economic system in this country, of the changing world. The 21st century is different than the 20th century. Maybe the failures of communism in the 20th century will not be repeated in the 21st century. Or the flip side of that, maybe capitalism will actually truly flourish with the help of automation in the 21st century. And I don't think anyone knows. So people like you are basically saying arguing for ideas, and we have to explore those ideas together. Why do you think if universal healthcare is popular, why don't we have universal healthcare in the United States?
Well, democracy is a great thing. Political democracy is wonderful. It came from the struggles of ordinary people to expand suffrage and so on. But the economic sphere, entrenched power in the economic sphere, bleeds into our political democracy. So I think there's a lot of people with a vested interest in not having universal health care. There's large industries with a vested interest in not having universal health care. They pay for ads, pay lobbyists, they influence government, and they have made it very difficult. So you can't get universal health care done without the bill, even if you pass something you're trying to make a change. Obamacare was supposed to have a public option. Everybody's been running on a public option for the Democratic Party for 12, 13 years. Why don't we have a public option? People know that if people have the choice of buying into a government plan, that might be the slow road to really having universal health care. So I think a lot of it's opposition.
Idea is the public option. Maybe you can because isn't there complexities pre-existing conditions? So isn't a public option mean you can not have any insurance until you get into trouble, and then you can, if it covers pre-existing conditions, just start paying for insurance then. Therefore, young people don't pay for insurance. Isn't it better to go full in?
I don't support a public option in part because I think if we allow politicians to just say, hey, I support a public option, it's just kind of a way to signal your support for universal health care but give us nothing. And I think that's what we saw with Biden and a lot of other politicians that have supported public option. I think in practice, if a public option is defined in such a way that it just means you by default
can just opt in to a public plan, and let's say hypothetically you don't even have to pay for it, then it's just a backdoor to universal healthcare quickly, because I think the vast majority of people who aren't currently covered, and also a lot of employers, to be honest, would probably drop their private coverage if they knew their employees could just get a public option and maybe would only provide supplemental insurance or whatever else. But I think the broad overarching point of all these demands is to say that socialists need to be really connected to the day-to-day struggles of people to just improve their lives. So if you're feeling like you're paying $400, $500 on the Obamacare market for health insurance, and that's hampering your ability to do what you want to do in your life, then maybe you would support a candidate for universal health care. If you feel like you're struggling to find work that you can afford to pay your rent with or whatever else, maybe you'll support a candidate committed to all sorts of mechanisms to reduce housing prices or increase your power as a tenant, and whatever else. So I think it's like these day-to-day concerns need to be connected to the more abstract and lofty vision of change. Otherwise, our politics just becomes like this fantasy world thing that's nice ideas to think about or debate, but really won't make much of a difference in people's lives.
What do you think about free college? Should college be free?
So I would say free college is not at the top of my list of priorities, but it definitely should be free in my vision of a just society.
What is the idea? Just to clarify, is the universal healthcare up there?
Yeah, universal healthcare is probably far higher on my priorities than free college. I think right now the way our system is built, when someone goes to college, they're given credentials, they're given a degree they carry with them the rest of their life, a chance to join kind of a privileged part of the labor market, right? It's not a zero-sum game. I don't want college-educated people to think that non-college-educated people are their enemies and vice versa. Because a lot of them are just ordinary working-class people trying to survive, and they're in different areas, they're in different sectors. Some of them are in nursing sectors where they need a college degree and so on. But if you just make college tuition free, but you don't also make trade skills and other things free for someone to learn how to become an electrician or a plumber or whatever else, then to some degree you're privileging one sector of the labor market over another. So I would advocate just, if you're going to make something like that free, you just have to make sure that you're doing it in an egalitarian way, and that the options, the routes to college are more equal. So there's more investment in K-12 education, so that more kids in rough neighborhoods have the chance to go to college, and for those that choose the trade route from any part of the country, that they're given the skills and resources for vocational trainings, and that those are also free. And it just feels like, in terms of order of operation, I would just start with K-12 education, improving it, and whatever else, then college after. But I'm not opposed to it.
So does that, improving K-12 education, does that mean investing more into it? Is it as simple as just increasing the amount of money that's invested in public education?
In general, when it comes to the public sector or any sphere that you're investing in, obviously it's not just as simple as throwing money at a problem. I do think we have a lot of schools that are underfunded, but we have other schools that are adequately funded, but the conditions in which those schools are, like the neighborhoods they're in and what's going on in society, the problems are so deep that it's impossible for just education to solve everything. And I think especially a lot of liberals think that education should be the panacea. Invest in education, you'll help people. If kids are living in poverty, if they go into school hungry, or whatever else, like, education is not going to give them everything they need to succeed. So sometimes I think, put too much weight on education.
And of course, you could define education more broadly, which is like the care of the flourishing of the young mind, whatever that is.
Yeah, a lot of it starts early. Yeah, a lot of it starts with. So in New York City, at least, we do have universal pre-K. So from age 3 onward, you have the option for that. I mean, it's important for kids' socialization. Their parents are now able to, know that they could go to work or do something else and have their kids taken care of. There's a lot of measures like that we could do to equalize things. And again, for libertarians in the audience, some of this stuff is scary because it's obviously more state involved in pre-K. State's already very involved in K through 12. More investment into state institutions like our state universities and college. But for me, it's not a question of state versus non-state. It's a question of good outcomes for people. And it just happens to be that for working class people, having the collective power to elect representatives that will build a broader safety net is in their interest. For upper middle class people, for others, they could afford to pay for their own provisioning either directly or through like Obamacare-like schemes where you just get a subsidy and you pay the rest yourself and whatever. This is for really the bottom 40% plus of the population. They really don't have any options, so they prioritize other things. And they end up with some sort of injury or health problem or whatever else, and it's bad for everyone in society, but it's especially bad for the people at the bottom of the labor market.
So I saw various estimates for socialist programs like Social Security expansion, free college, Medicare for all will cost upwards of $40 trillion over 10 years, 40. Okay, they could argue with those numbers and so on, but so there's a cost. There's a taxpayer cost. Given the weight of that cost, can you still make the case for these programs, and then can you try to make the case against them that the cost is too high?
So I will not argue with you on the numbers. This is just random numbers. I do think universal health care, if done right, can be basically cost neutral. I think it's an exception because we spend a tremendous amount of money on healthcare, a huge percentage of our GDP. So I think it could be done in a way that's close to cost neutral.
So actually, can you argue on the numbers without arguing on the numbers? So you're saying just your gut says that there's a lot of, depending on how these programs are done, there's a lot of variance in how much it will actually cost.
There's a lot of bureaucracy and billing right now in our healthcare sector, for example, that would be eliminated. There's a lot of costs that are spiraling upward of provider costs from both doctors, hospitals, but also pharmaceuticals and drug costs that insurance companies shoulder because their market share is too fragmented to really negotiate hard. Medicare could sometimes negotiate better rates, but Medicare for all would negotiate even better rates. So I think there's a cost spiral that we could adjust with more government involvement. There's a reason why we spend a bigger share of our GDP on healthcare than other places. But let me just accept the broad premise that social programs cost money. Now, I think that one, for ordinary people, most of them, the trade-off of, even hypothetically, if taxes on lower middle class and working class people in certain cases go up, the trade-off would still be in their benefit because they're